Well, hello. I want to welcome both our audience here and our Zoom audience. We have a number of people joining us via Zoom. I want to mention that we have a really wonderful exhibit right now, right outside the doors. So make sure you see some of the artifacts that are on load here from General Hartranft. We have a treat today for those who are with us for an early cookie recipe from 1824 from Ephrata. It's a Lebkuchen. It's not very sweet. I'm told it's interesting, but not like our contemporary cookies. And we have that on the back table if you want to take a look at the recipe and sample one after the program. Today we have historian Bob Wood joining us to speak on bake ovens. Bob is part of the Goshenhoppen Historians, also does a series of history lectures at Studio B in Boyertown, and has spoken here a number of times. So I'm glad to welcome him here today.
Thank you, Sarah. Happy to be here. Happy to see you all. Such a nice reception and group to talk to. I always like to start my talks out with a story. I always call it a true story, and it's often a joke, but this is a true story. I'd given this program some time ago to a group, and a woman halfway through said, "Aha, so that's what that is." On her way to work, there was a beautiful old 18th century historic house, and they did a beautiful job restoring it. And she could not understand why they put a little roof and they put the propane tank against the side of the house. It made no sense. And of course, partway through my talk, it says, "Aha, it's not a propane tank, it's the bake oven." That's a true story. I have another true story, not relative to bake ovens, but an interesting story nonetheless. About a mile away from my house on Leidy Road, there was a dairy by Joe Sullivan, who was a friend, acquaintance of mine, and put a jug milk place there. There's where they used to retail the milk directly. Most of those places are gone now. There were a lot of them around. And so he's standing in the parking lot, and a car pulls up, and somebody gets out and looks around and said, "Now, how did you get permission to put a farm in the middle of this residential area?" He said, "Lady, this farm's been here for 250 years. So those are both true stories about history. Okay. Pennsylvania Dutch bake ovens, 1720 to 1920. My wife always scolds me when I'm doing a presentation when I read the text that's on the screen. And I did this at a program some time ago, and partway through, she was sitting in the back. She says, "I can't read that." So I'll read it. Amos Long, famous book, Pennsylvania Farm Family, said, 1871 issue of the Agricultural Almanac by John Bear's Sons reads, "A good brick oven for baking breads and pies and cakes is worth all the ranges and cook stoves that one could store in the kitchen. In such an oven, everything will be baked just right, above, below, and through and through." And of course, kitchen cook stoves came along later. They're after the Civil War. And the first ones are really quite small, and they just got bigger and bigger. And by the 20th century, they were the size that we're familiar with. But almost all cooking was done on the hearth. It was all hearth cooking. And usually a bake oven was an adjunct to the hearth. Okay. There we have the kitchen garden bake oven at the Antes Plantation, Colonial Road. That's a restoration of the bake oven. They thought they found the foundation there, and it would be a typical location as it would be close to the kitchen. Hannah Kriebel Schultz, wife of Thomas Schultz, baking in a brick bake oven near her house on the farm along Route 100 near Schoolhouse Lane. So we see there, I don't have a pointer here, but of course she's using a bread peel, and it looks like the ash shovel is against the wall there toward the right side. And on the left side, there's the ash scraper to scrape the ashes out. And Typically, there's a little bench there that she's putting the bread loaves on. A bit of history, drawings from hieroglyphics in the Egyptian pyramids and tombs, bread making. Without going through it, bread making. A carbonized loaf from Pompeii with the baker's stamp here, the baker's advertising stamp on it. Yeah. So bread goes all the way back. Roman flour mill and bakery. These were interesting mills. This comes to a point up here, and then this fits on top and fits over it. Imagine slaves or someone, poles coming out here, turned this top thing by hand, and as that turned, it ground the grain, and it came out the bottom there. Anyway, the reason I put that picture of Hannah Schultz in is because some things don't change. Medieval, the bread peel, the bench, a bit of water there probably to wash out the hearth before you break in it. The source of that picture, I like to say, is it's a SOTI. That stands for something off the internet. Something off the internet. In the walled towns of the Germanic region, bake ovens were communal, one or two serving the whole town, because in the German farming areas, of course, the houses were clustered together in a small village or town, and the fields surrounded that. That would work. Here, the owner's buildings were right in the middle of his holdings, and they lived more isolated. They didn't live communally in a village, they lived isolated. So as time went on, everyone sort of developed their own bake oven, I would imagine. Okay, first part, location. Bake ovens were constructed on the outside of a gable wall of the house. The gable wall is the one that comes to a point at the top, or later a gable of the summer kitchen, in the jamb wall of the kitchen hearth, or they were freestanding a short distance from the house. There was no one way. This is a nice bank house with a cellar kitchen. Many bank houses had a cellar kitchen, that is often a brick floor, and the cooking hearth was down in the cellar. And there would be stairs there. They'd carry the food upstairs, or if it was some places, they could even eat in the cellar, I suppose. But anyway, there in the lower left is the bake oven. And it would be located there because the bake oven needs a chimney. Every bake oven has to have a chimney. So they would use the hearth cooking chimney, and it would double as the bake oven chimney. And so the hearth cook would have a little door in the back of her hearth, her cooking area, that opened out into the bake oven. So it was very convenient. You would be cooking, no, it was inside. The bake oven itself was outside the outer wall of the house. But for the cook was inside the house at her cooking hearth, and there'd be a door there that opened to the interior of the bake oven. As we will see. And every time I do this program, I have this here is a nice example of the bake oven under that little roof there in the lower left, and would use that central chimney that goes up through that gable wall. And every time I give this program, I forget where that historic site is. And someone in the audience always says, oh, that's so-and-so. Does anybody know where that site is? No? Well, then it shall remain a mystery. But it's a nice example of a bake oven in the gable wall of a house where they often were. Now, of course, in the German houses with a central fireplace, you would not have that. They almost always would have an outside bake oven. There's some thought, and rarely, that they may have had here and there an inside bake oven. The Hans Herr house has one restored like that, but it would not have been common, if that is accurate at all. Summer kitchen with attached bake oven, Jackson Township, Lebanon County. Every house, every farmhouse, and many non-farmhouses in the 19th century had a summer kitchen. And this was very common. The summer kitchen, of course, being an adjunct kitchen to the house used, as the name suggests, in the summer. And the summer kitchen would have a cooking hearth. You can see the chimney there. And part of that is the bake oven, which is there under that roof, and the bake oven itself being outside, but it was used from the inside, from the cooking hearth in the summer kitchen. Here's another one. This is in New Hanover Township. The bake oven is in that little shed adjunct and used the chimney going up there to that little summer kitchen. This is a Hess homestead in Lancaster County. It's a beautiful restoration. When you first looked at this, I thought, it's a curiosity. Why is that bake oven there built against a log wall of the house with no chimney? It seems to be under a pent roof, but it's a sort of an optical illusion. There really is a chimney there. I'll get to that in a minute. It's restored, of course. As the text there says, clay tile roof. Many times, almost always, they'd have a clay tile roof. It didn't take many tiles, and most structures that had a chimney had a clay tile roof or a wood shingle roof, not a thatched roof as many structures had at the time. But since there was always a fire in the bake oven, they tended to have clay tile roofs. See that little ventilation hole in the bottom there? I don't have, well, if you can see it, I don't have my pointer here. They always had that little ventilation hole in the bottom. The reason for that is, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Here's that Hess farmstead. If I don't have a pointer here, but on the right side, back here is the bake oven, and it all works. It's actually a gable wall. It's a big penthouse, and the bake oven's back around the corner. It's a very beautiful restoration. Or the bake ovens were freestanding a short distance from the house. Yes.
Oops. Go back to the slide, yeah. Oh, there it is. Now, you have a point. Okay. I have to do something. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Better and better. Or they were freestanding a short distance from the house. That is a restoration on the Ante site, restored by the Goshenhofen historians. Outdoor bake oven, West Nantmeal Township. The hood at the left is lined with shelves. The original oven door had been blocked and a small metal door inserted. The section on the right of the oven had no windows, suggesting perhaps a later conversion to a smokehouse. Many times there would be, well, not many times, you will find bake oven, smokehouse combinations that could use similar fire sometimes. All bake ovens, the oven itself was brick. It was lined with brick. The dome of the bake oven was brick and the floor was brick. It's a brickworks mud mill. That's probably less than a mile from here. Of course, the clay would be dug out, put in there as a grinder. The poor horse would walk in a circle, grinding it, and it would come out. The clay would come out there in the bottom, get shoveled into a wheelbarrow, taken, and here are wet bricks, taken somewhere into a mold, and wet bricks made. They made bricks by the thousands. There was a building boom in bricks around 1850 around here. Barns, structures, school, everything. Every brick was like the Cadillac of building materials. And it was around that time, mid-19th century, because that's when the railroads came along to bring coal.
from around 1800 to 1840 or 50, there was a firewood shortage in this vicinity, big firewood shortage, but 1800 in Philadelphia. Hard to believe, but the extensive virgin forests around here were leveled in a very short amount of time. It was reported that you could smell the smoke 100 miles out at sea as they were burning the forest. And of course, brick making took tremendous amount of wood, as did the iron furnaces. Took an acre of wood a day to keep an iron furnace running in charcoal, an acre a day. And so within a short time between charcoal for blacksmiths and furnaces and of course firewood for fireplaces. English houses in Philadelphia had a fireplace in every room, and in the wintertime, if they kept those going all the time, it took as much as 20 cores of wood a year. Here's one pause to think. It was probably wet wood. It would smolder, and you would have literally thousands of fireplaces smoldering in a city on a calm, windless day, or when it was foggy or humid. I don't see how you could see from one side of the street to the other for smoke. It must have been so smoky, and of course, it didn't bother people. It's the way it was. Okay, but on with the construction of brick. Early bake ovens were universally had clay tile roofs and ventilation ports at ground level. And here you can see the ventilation port here on this one. They all had ventilation ports at ground level. And people think, well, shouldn't do that. And people think that that's where they kept the wood to keep it dry, but it's not. That wasn't what it was for. It was because I was in a large one of these, I wormed my way back inside in the ventilation port and took a photograph straight up. And that's what you see when you're looking straight up. The hearth itself is built on logs. And one has to wonder why they didn't just fill it in with rubble stone and rock there and build a hearth on that. Not the way they did it. Squared logs. And of course, that ventilation port is to get ventilation underneath there so the logs don't rot, I would imagine. So, but they were all, the base of the hearth universally were squared logs like that. This is the restoration at the Auntie's house. They had, you built the stone base. Now there's no one way. The one that they copied for this did it this way. How to get that away from the bottom? Well, I'll leave it go. Brick, like that, there you are. But of course, that brick hearth sits on a bed of about 6 inches of clay and a few inches of sand on top of that. And that packed clay sits on top of the squared logs. Now, they're not, the bake oven itself is not a dome and it's not a tunnel. It's the best way to describe it is imagine a deviled egg. If you cut an egg in half, that's kind of the shape of it with a pointy end where the door was. There was a very fine summer kitchen and bake oven near where I live on Rummick Road, which has since been destroyed by developers. But there's the old style. This is probably around 1850. The old style brick construction of a bake oven, just taking the camera in and sort of taking a picture straight up. It's tricky brickwork. It's not that easy. And it's a good job because, well, it was still standing here well up until about 10 years ago. But that's the brickwork on the top interior of the bake oven. They weren't deep. They were maybe 20 inches, 22 inches deep between the top and the bottom. Of course, there was no fire in there while you were baking. It wasn't like a pizza oven where they have fire on one side and the pizza on the other. There was no fire in there while you were baking. They had a good roaring fire going in it for an hour or two, and then it was the residual heat that did the baking. Yes, sir.
Pompeii, and I was told there
Could be. I've never been to Pompeii. You'd know better than I. Yes. Yeah, I was just saying this was pizza ovens have a fire in there while the pizza's baking, but these didn't. Also, curiously enough, in the back of this one that I was referring to on Rummick Road, it was a Reif Schneider house that's since been demolished. And there was what we just called it a slider brick. And as we go along, I'll explain the use of it. But there was, in fact, right here, an opening 2 bricks wide. A brick was in there. It had 2 slots cut in it for a finger hole, and you could put it over here and block this little chimney off, or you could slide it over here and open the little chimney up. And that little chimney that actually went, the opening of it was in the back of the bake oven, maybe a foot or 2 up from the hearth at the floor of the bake oven, and it went around through the masonry of the bake oven, and it curled around much like a squirrel's tail curls around when it's sitting hunched up and it has its tail curled over its back. And a squirrel tail flue. And it comes out there, and that location there is in the hearth, that's the inside of the hearth. Here's the top of the arch of the door that lead the bake oven door on the inside and the back of the hearth. And the chimney is right up above. That is right up there is the chimney. And this squirrel tail flue empties into the chimney. The object of it is to help to heat more rapidly and more thoroughly the dome of the bake oven, because the baking is done with residual heat from the fire that had been in there. In that same summer kitchen, incidentally, they incorporated a smokehouse. There was a smokehouse there, and there was a little arched brick thing for the fire for the smokehouse. The trick with smokehouse fires is you couldn't get them too hot or you'd cook the fat out of the meat. And it had to be really a slow smoldering fire that didn't get too hot. So that one was kept under control, I suppose, by having it enclosed like that. There's probably more to the enclosure originally, but that's not up to our point. The roofs were usually clay tile. That's the restoration at the Gosh and Hoppen at the auntie's house. Those clay tiles were hung on. They weren't connected. There was a little knob at the top of the tile, a little knob attached to the top of the tile, and it hung on those slats. It hung on those cross pieces. It just hung there by weight, and it wasn't really nailed fast or anything. And you can see light up through there, and you think, well, that would leak like mad, but it tended not to, because as you probably know, the clay tiles had finger marks that drew the water down to the middle, and when they drained the water off, they drained it into the middle of the tile below them. And each one gathered the water and drained it to the middle of the tile below. And between capillary attraction and draining the water to the center of the tile below, they didn't leak that much. It was never a problem. Likewise in houses, it didn't leak water. It leaked snow in the wintertime, and get blowing, drifting snow. There'd be a few inches of snow in the attic, but or anybody that was sleeping up there. But they didn't leak the way you would think they would, because they weren't laid out like a shingle. They were just side by side in rows. Anyway, there's the top of the dome of the bake oven. There needed to be a good fire in the bake oven for several hours to thoroughly heat the dome. And then that fire would be pulled out with a certain tool that you would pull, like a scraper, that you would scrape the fire out, scrape the embers out. And then, of course, you had the embers at your feet. So what you could do, well, you douse them with, or scrape it into a big bucket of water, or push it aside and douse it with water, something like that. So what some bake ovens builders did is right here, it's actually an ash clean out. And if you lift it by that ring, you could pull the hot embers down down through that into a chamber below that could be emptied later, so you didn't have those hot embers at your feet or have to deal with them. Some had that, some didn't. This is probably the smallest bake oven that I've ever seen. It's in the jamb wall of a house estimated built around, 1810 or 1820. It's of course demolished. It was the New Hanover Lutheran Church parsonage, was built in the 1780s, and shortly thereafter, it was like a Philadelphia house, like a hall and parlor house, and shortly thereafter, there was another one built right aside of it, giving a Georgian symmetry, and then newer one built right aside of it when it was demolished. Lo and behold, here in the jamb wall of the cooking fireplace was a little bake oven, and it's the smallest bake oven that I've ever seen. And there was no dome on it. It was just brick and clay on top. And it was only a foot wide. And the whole thing was a foot wide. There was an ash clean out in the bottom. This doesn't show it very well. I mean, the perspective is wrong, but there was an ash clean out. It was, sorry, this got a little bit upside down. It was about, it was about 2 feet deep. It was a foot wide and 2 feet deep. And it had the same thing, the brick didn't slide, but there was a slot there where you could put the brick in. The reason for that brick was when you were firing it, when you had the fire going in it, that fire would literally go up through that squirrel tail flue, and sometimes you could even see the fire coming out here where that brick is coming out into the main chimney. But when you were done firing it, you wanted to hold the heat in there. You didn't want the heat to go up the chimney, so you'd put a brick there to block it off, so that the heat inside the dome in the baking area didn't cool off and go up the chimney. Later, as I say, later, an ash pit was added here. This is just a drawing, but an ash pit here was added to clean out, sometimes incorporated in the base, so to deal with the hot embers that you would pull out before you wanted to bake. Okay. The restoration of the summer kitchen and the gable wall bake oven, and this is in New Hanover Township Historical Society, and that picture there was that, that bake oven, that little summer kitchen is there on that site. It's in the Swamp Creek Park in the New Hanover Township Park, and the New Hanover Township historians were involved in restoring that summer kitchen. And in weather permitting, members do hearth cooking there on Fridays and do whatever needs to be done. There's a little demonstration garden out front, 1850 demonstration garden and so on. And it's a really nice little summer kitchen that we do hearth cooking on. I like to say it's the best working summer kitchen in the whole Swamp Creek and the many tributaries. So it was made like this. It was restored like this. When we got it, I was involved there. When we got it, the bake oven was totally gone, and that little building there, little building there, that little lean-to, was used as a shed with tools and things in it. But on the wall, on the gable wall of the summer kitchen, you could see the ghost of a bake oven. So we set about restoring the bake oven as it had been. That's the interior of the summer kitchen. Here's the door that leads to the bake oven. Here's the cooking area. We put an end plate of a 10-plate stove down here for a fire back, which they would have done. And all the materials and so forth in there are all authentic. It's a really nice little working summer kitchen. The township owned the building and didn't know what it was. They were going to bulldoze it away. And this was 10 or 15 years ago. And Roadmaster said to me one time, "That little house, there's a fireplace." Sorry. That's what she said not to do. She said, "There's a fireplace." She said, "There's a fireplace in the back there with wooden doors in front of it." And I said, well, let's go take a look at that. And it was all the originals, all there. So that was a really nice, I can turn this, see if I can turn this up, see if it'll behave. So that was a nice, worthwhile thing to try to restore. There's one of our members, Jacqueline Daly, in the summer kitchen. Everything in the summer kitchen is right. It's all like, nothing's good. It's all old stuff, like a summer kitchen would have had: the table, the chairs, the mismatched chairs, and so on. It's like a summer kitchen would have been. So, and she's an excellent hearth cook. Anything you make in the stove, she can make on the hearth. We often have, I like to say, haute cuisine along the Swamp Creek. But it's quite an interesting thing. Okay, in the restoration of that, here in that, this is in the summer kitchen there. Around here, you can still see the outline, the ghost of where the original dome was. This here, of course, the iron door is here, right there. And this double line here is the floor of the hearth, the brick floor of the hearth where it will be. And this double line down here are the logs of the hearth. And of course, the stone base down underneath stone base is a building down underneath here. I remember Bill Daly did the stone work, and it was mostly his project. Jacqueline and his wife and Bill built it. It's going up there. We cheated and just put concrete down here to seal off the water. So you'll have this. Now, we ran into a little problem because Liz took a piece of roof out to work on it. And somewhere along the line, they built a heavy wall along what would be along the top here, down underneath these shingles, because this summer kitchen, it's like the wall is like 1 brick thick or 2 bricks thick, and it's just put right in the mud. There's practically no footing underneath it. And of course, it was sinking and cracking back years ago, and they bucked it up with another wall. The problem then with putting another wall there is the door is here, and you can't really, it was in the way, the wall was in the way. So what Bill did was just simply twist the whole thing a little. You'll never realize it from the inside or anywhere, but the whole thing is a little bit twisted. Here in the back is the squirrel tail. There's a hole in the back of the wall here, and this flue, this adjunct flue coming up through the dome of the bake oven is right there. Getting higher and higher yet, and here, of course, is the squirrel tail, and that will all be encased in the clay when the dome gets up as high as it's going to go. There the base is finished with the dome of the bake oven on top of it. The brick dome is plastered with about 6 inches of clay, creek sand, and lime mix. The cracks are filled in with the same mix. This is a mix that was used, except in the old days, they used unslaked lime. The lime that you would get right from the lime kiln was chemically active. In the lime kiln, the chemically held water is driven off, and the limestone devolves down into like a powder, and to use it, you must slake it, you must put water to it. Now, when you put water to it, there's a fierce chemical reaction. Put a half a bucket of lime and pour water in it, it will literally boil. But that was the lime they used for whitewash and plaster and everything. And it was it was the best lime, that different characteristics from the lime that we get these days. These days, if you go to a lumber yard, the builder's lime that you get is slaked lime. That is, it's had the water added to it already. I imagine they do that because the unslaked lime is a fiercely caustic and chemically active. you would not want to get a little in your eye. So probably keep away from it, she said. Okay. Probably out of fear of lawsuits or something, whatever. It's not really made in the United States. Restoration contractors can still get it. I think they import it from Europe or something, but it's not commonly available. So we used builder's lime, which seemed to work for our purposes about as well. And of course, being clay, it cracks, but it filled in the cracks. That's the interior there. Down at the bottom, down here, of course, is here's the iron door of the bake oven. And when you have a fire going, when you're heating the bake oven, the iron door is open, and fire and smoke comes out here and goes up the chimney. And also the flue, the squirrel tail flue is here, and that also goes up the chimney, the heat from that. There's a brick, we rescued that brick from the house that was being destroyed. It's interesting because it has those two little finger notches in it, so you could slide it back and forth. This isn't a slide or slot, but that's what it was for originally. They cut little finger notches in it. That's the back of the bake oven that I mentioned before and had photographed before. And there, of course, is the squirrel tail flue coming out into the fireplace. Here in the back, you can see there were two entrances. There's one here to the squirrel tail flue, and there's one over here. There were two entrances to it. It must have been a double, and they must have gone up in here and joined somewhere. But that's some fancy brickwork. Here's somebody's making one nowadays, something off the internet. They're using fire brick. Well, I would imagine they're not trying to do an authentic Pennsylvania Dutch bake oven, and they're using fire brick for whatever their purposes are. But I put it in because it's a nice illustration of making the squirrel tails, and which is the flue that goes up through the dome. And that was that one. Okay, moving along, the use of the bake oven. As I said before, some things don't change, and there we are. All the way back, medieval, a dough tray on a bench, presumably bags of flour on the floor, and the dough trays almost had those little handles there. Some were large, some were small dough trays. It's where you would mix up the flour and the yeast and the other ingredients and put it in there to rise overnight or however long, as you do when you're making flour. There's a small lidded dough tray, top view, right, looking down on it. Following series of slides, courtesy of Goshenop historians. Things in their museum. That's a regular sized Pennsylvania Dutch dough tray. Hold maybe 10, 15 pounds of flour and the other water, liquid, and yeast. There's a lid to it. The lid is standing up right behind it here. Those were lidded, and then it would be put close to the fire, and so it would rise overnight. There's a bird cage. Many of in the old days, birds it was said, popular in the kitchen. There was a Carolina parakeet lived around here. It's extinct because it lived along the East Coast. And so it was a parakeet, and they would often keep those. Rye straw bread baskets. These were ubiquitous. They were everywhere. A large bake oven might make 10, 12 loaves or more at a time. And you needed that many bread baskets. The dough for the loaf of bread, a linen cloth would be put down. The dough would be put on that linen cloth over the top, and it would rise in there. The rye straw, because they were indeed made of rye straw, basically one long coil of rye straw bound together with strips of white oak strips. White oak, when it was green and wet and just cut. You could delaminate it and just cut strips and delaminate it. Well, nothing was easy, but it was doable. And that was used. And once that white oak dried, it was like iron. It would last forever. A peel is a flat shovel-like implement, especially one used by a baker for carrying loaves, pies, etc., into and out of an oven. These were shaved to a rather sharp edge. It's a pie on the left and bread on the right. These were also in the Goshenhoppen Museum. I like this, that the bread peel was broken and somebody cleaned it up, fitted it together and mended it with 2 forged nails. One here, and there's one over here. Sometime I'd like to do a museum of mended pieces from the Pennsylvania Dutch. A tray to carry 6 pies from the bake oven to the house. Scorch marks there from the bottom. The clay pie plates. Pie plate mended with copper wire, bottom view. A 2-cent pie plate broke. Rather than throw it away, they carefully drilled little holes and used copper wire to bind it together and continued to use it. I know they used it because the copper wire is worn flat in the bottom. So they slid it in and out of the bake oven. They used that, it was mended together like that. Here's an interesting pie dish, pie plate. I think they used to call them pie dishes, but they're small. Pies originally were small. Our pies, and they were not deep dish. They tended to be small and shallow, the fruit pies, and very little sugar, if any. They might have some honey or maybe a little bit of sugar, but we would find them tart, probably, thin and tart. But that generally was the way they were. And the Pennsylvania Dutch did not bring pies with them. They developed here. They evolved out of the English fruit pies, which was a raised dough like pizza dough, and with the fruit in it and baked. And the Pennsylvania Dutch pastry shelled fruit pies evolved from that. But back in the day when they started, they were small and they were pretty thin. That's an interesting pie dish or pie plate there. That's from a relative of mine. It's a Conrad Renninger. Would have been a great uncle or something. I'm a descendant of Conrad Renninger, but not this Conrad Renninger. It's a different line from the same family. Anyway, it says 1838 Renninger. This was made with stencils, which is fairly uncommon. The redware was made, paper stencils were put on. We have the horse, a heart, a double eagle, and probably like a fence. And then it was dipped in a white, or covered one way or another with a white clay from New Jersey, which turned yellowish when the lead glaze was put on. Anyway, the stencil was peeled off and you saw the redware plate underneath it, and that's how the design was made. This is a good authentic one, because looking at the green here, green was hard to make for the potter. The green was a copper oxide. And my understanding is, I've never done it, but my understanding is you take thin sheets of copper, suspend it in a pot with an inch or 2 of vinegar in the bottom, cover the whole thing tightly, come back a month later, and there'd be like a green fuzz on the copper. You'd scrape that off, and then that was your green colorant in the glaze. There wasn't much of it. I don't know when the dark green came along. I don't know, but much of your early Pennsylvania Dutch pottery has that not much green, a little touch of green, because like I say, the green oxide was hard to make. That incidentally sold for $38,000, that plate, because it has everything right about it. It's dated, the name, the potter, the date, and it has eagles and it's unique. So that was that. Custard shells could be placed in the oven and then filled. That's a custard shell filler. Of course, if you had a pastry shell full of custard, you couldn't really get it in and out without spilling it. So he put the empty shell in and put the custard in and put the liquid in there and slide it in. The drying trays. When bake ovens, after the baking was done, it was around 400, 450 degrees. How did the cook know that temperature? Well, she stuck her arm in to see that it felt right. The bake oven, probably in a farmstead, would have been used by a girl from the time she was a little girl on up. And if she stayed in the same farmstead or if she moved, it didn't matter. They knew how to do it. There were different ways to test the temperature. I mean, you could put in chicken feathers, and if they'd curl up, it was hot enough. Or a piece of paper, and if it were brown, it was hot enough. But most of them they just knew from week after week, year after year of doing this. It was just a learned skill. Anyway, when they were done baking, there was a good bit of residual heat in the bake oven, so they'd used to dry fruit and dry vegetables, anything that they wanted to preserve and dry for the winter. There was no canning before, like post-Civil War, there was no canning, and to preserve things for the winter, apples or vegetables or string beans or anything, they were dried. And so there were drying trays that would be put in the bake oven, closed up again, and you come back the next morning and the stuff's all dried, and there you go. Those are beautiful drying trays, custom made by one of the historians for the bake oven. The middle one would be put in first, it would be slid in. No, the side ones would be put in first, and then the middle one would be slid in, and they'd all fit perfectly. Most beautiful drying trays in the world. These, however, were probably not like most housewives' drying trays. Their drying trays look more like this. And it's a contraption of nailed together boards with shingles and pieces and whatnot all nailed together. And so there we are with a working drying tray. Now, the Verhexed bake oven story. Somewhere in Northumbria County, maybe Lehigh County, up in that vicinity, there was a Pennsylvania Dutch bake oven, and some new owner got the house, and he wanted this old dilapidated bake oven torn away. And the local Dutchman wouldn't touch it. They said it was Verhexed. There's spirits in there. They said that they won't go near that bake. It's a bad bake oven. Something not right about it. When you'd put getting better at this. When you'd put bread in there, it would come out with letters impressed in the bottom. And there'd be letters there in the bottom. And something was in there putting letters, sending messages or something. And the owner said, well, let me worry about the Verhexed. Let me worry about the witches and the ghosts. You just tear it down. I'll take care of it. Well, when they tore it down, they found that nearby there was a cemetery, and the masons had used the footstones from the cemetery that were being demolished, and they've used the footstones as the hearth. So the bread was going down into the initials that were in the footstones. So that was how that turned out. And finally, if you'd want to know how hot it is or if it's hot enough, there's the way to do it. That's the end. Thanks for watching. Questions, comments, observations? Anyone? Something? Got to fill in 10 minutes here. We can eat cookies. Yes.
Why did you say bake ovens were demolished? For new construction, why are some of them demolished?
Why is anything demolished? I guess they often would tear those away, and if there was a shed, they'd use the shed to store tools and things in. The bake ovens themselves did tend to, they wanted to collapse because the arch was so shallow. They were a brick arch, and they didn't have cement. They just had lime putty, and the arch was shallow. And over time, from being heated and cooled many times, the dome itself tended to want to collapse. But why were they torn away? I don't know. Ask the people who tore them away. There's a lot of them around yet, but a lot are gone.
Bob, we have a comment from one of our Zoom listeners. Marjorie Reagan says, I bake in an oven in Stroudsburg, which has a clean out in that spot to remove the coals from under the hearth. And then Craig Sellers has a question. Can you remind me if tomatoes were around during this time and if folks used them in the ovens?
What was again, that last one again, please?
If tomatoes were around then and if folks used them in the ovens?
Were tomatoes around
Yeah.
when you eat pizza? And did people use them in their ovens? My understanding is that tomatoes were and are little used in Pennsylvania Dutch cuisine. Would that be right, Alan?
I think they were little used in anybody's cuisine till about 1800. And by 1820, I find the Pennsylvania Dutch were making ketchup. So,
Ketchup by 1820.
yeah, but what your questioner is getting at, whether tomatoes were around with the bake-up, I have no idea what anybody would have used to bake up in the tomatoes, because of the diet oil lined up with seeds and a bunch of.
Yes, as for your Zoom viewer, probably. I wish it wouldn't do that.
Bob, could
Yeah.
you summarize what Alan said? Those of us on Zoom couldn't hear it as well.
Yes, of course. What Alan said was, by 1820, they were making ketchup already. And however, as to the question of the person, were tomatoes used somehow in bake oven cooking or bake oven fare in cuisine? Probably not. He suggested that if you would put tomatoes in a bake oven, you'd be left with nothing but skin and seeds after it tried to dry it or use it. But they weren't ordinarily used in cooking. No. Okay?
Thanks.
Yes. An organization that builds new bake ovens. I don't know of any. Probably there's you'll find somebody to do anything. Just look around online and somebody will be glad to build a bake oven for you. But of any bake oven building organization, I don't know. Probably not, specifically because there's not enough call for it. Was that gentleman here said, I'll build you one? Yeah.
Did they make several types of breads like rye or wheat?
They made generally, well, Alan can address that better than I. Rye bread doesn't rise, and you have to have a good percentage of wheat flour in it for the gluten to rise. Rye flour will not rise at all. So most rye flour and rye bread and pumpernickel, as we would say, is maybe a half wheat flour and half rye flour or something thereabouts. And so far as other breads, I don't know, but there has to be some wheat flour with it to make it rise.
I find that rye bread has maybe a cup of wheat flour per loaf.
Oh,
And the loaves weighed 5 pounds, finished, the old loaves.
that's hearty bread.
Yeah, well, and in order to eat them, they soak them in water to soften the crust, much so they could cut it without using a knife. So that in the evening, before you're getting ready to use a new loaf of bread, they wrapped it in a linen cloth with water, put it into a pewter basin, put it under the cupboard, underneath in the cupboard, and then in the morning, they had rye bread. But the travelers that went through the Dutch country complained about rye bread, crust wet, they didn't And that was up into the 20th century. They were still soaking the rye bread.
I see.
Crushed with wet towels.
Candace here is an employee here in this organization. Candace had an interesting observation, which I think might very well be true. And that is that they grew the rye, not for the rye grain, but for the rye straw for thatching. And the rye grain, there would be no reason to raise it because wheat busheled out about as well. And it was about twice as expensive. Wheat was like 3 shillings a bushel and rye was 2 shillings a bushel. So why would anyone raise it? Because,
I have an answer.
yes,
They made rye whiskey,
yes, yeah,
which would be all the reason to raise it.
yeah.
I don't know whether rye whiskey was made because they had excess rye or whether they raised rye so they had
Yeah,
rye whiskey.
right, squid, yeah.
But
They-
in Pennsylvania Dutch will not drink bourbon. That was not fit to drink.
Not fit to drink, rye whiskey. And that rye whiskey was high octane. That
Still is.
it still is. Any other observations or questions? Okay, let's eat. What does Lebkuchen mean? What does that, if you translate that into English, Leb and Kuchen would mean,
I don't know.
I thought it was molasses. Now there's, okay, I don't know. Well, I thought it was molasses cookie.
I think it means honey cake, but I could be wrong.
Honey cake.
They were originally honey cake. And then by the time they worked at it here, molasses was cheaper than honey, so
Right.
they used molasses.
Right.
I think the ones today are made with molasses.
Yes, hers are made with molasses. Right, Alice?
Yeah, and they're very, very plain.
Mhm.
I don't think cookie when you bite into it.
Think
Well,
more,
the cookies were not part of the language here until
No.
about 1900. Up until then, and my grandfather, who I grew up with, he never asked us, do you want a cookie? He always asked, do you want a cake?
yeah,
And it was depended on the situation. If they were small, which we would call cookies, he still called them cakes. If they were big, like for a birthday, they were cakes.
and Kuchen.
Yeah, cookie, big cookie.
Well, let's have a try at these Kuchen. Okay, thank you all for coming. Very nice.
Thank you.
All right.